Isn't it kinda wild that it's 2022 and Ratchet & Clank is still going strong? Like, so many other franchises from that era of 3D platformers have come and gone. Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, Ape Escape, even Crash and Spyro, two of the biggest names on PlayStation, died out for a while there. Yet, the Space Rat and his funny robot kept on chugging along, getting a new game almost every year until 2013 and still getting a couple more afterwards. Even though 2021's Rift Apart adopts modern gaming sensibilities and has production value that knocks almost every other game of the current era out of the water, it's still one of the only AAA developed games carrying the spirit of the 3D platformer on, around a quarter of a century since its inception. For me, Ratchet & Clank has been a part of my life since Christmas 2003, where Nan pegged a copy of Locked and Loaded at us, that's Going Commando for you freedom lovers, and the years that followed were me obsessively playing Up Your Arsenal and Gladiator, Deadlocked for you cheese inhalers, over and over again until one of my siblings discovered gaming and commandeered the PS2 so he could get his hours in on Sonic Unleashed and fucking Bakugan. Even knowing this, it's hard to believe that this series has been in my life for 19 years and that it celebrated its 20th anniversary a few months ago. It's kinda wild. But yeah, since the series turned 20 recently, I thought, what better way to celebrate than by ranking all the Ratchet & Clank games from least to most favourite? Well, maybe a couple of things, including a project I had in the works for years now that's got a 35,000 word script that makes me shit my jorts whenever I think about getting properly started on it, but this idea is fine too, I guess. Besides, I also want to pay homage to the series that pretty much kickstarted my channel. Maybe I'm not at the numbers I used to get back when I was making stupid CinemaSin style videos, but still, without them, God knows what I'd be doing today. Anyway, a couple things before we get stuck in. The video title says I'm ranking every game in the series, but that's a slight lie. I'm ranking every game in the series that released on a PlayStation system, because I haven't played Going Mobile or Before the Nexus, and we all know they'd end up at the bottom of the list anyway. Secondly, I shouldn't need to stress this, but this list is based purely on personal opinion and not objective quality. So don't get pissy with me if I say my favourite scrunkly space platformer is better than your favourite scrunkly space platformer. Of course, you're more than welcome to tell me your favourite games in the series and or bully me in the comments, and you totally should, because then YouTube says, "Oh, very good, Remy, we will show this video you worked very hard on to more people." Which would be nice. Give me views, I'm desperate. If you know me, you might be surprised to find that my least favourite Ratchet game is no longer Quest for Booty, and instead Size Matters reclaims that spot, as it rightfully should. Released on the PSP in 2007, Size Matters was an attempt at shrinking the beloved Ratchet & Clank formula down to fit a handheld system, which I reckon should never have been attempted. At least not in this way. Credit where it's due, Size Matters has ideas, a few of which I wouldn't have minded seeing in other games in the series. The armor customization was limited and you were always best off equipping a whole set if you had it, but it was cool nonetheless. And while Rift Apart let you mix and match different armor pieces as well, you were awarded bonuses for collecting them, not equipping them, so it wasn't really a true continuation of this idea. Buying upgrades for your weapons was also a neat touch. This is something I've mentioned in the past. I'd love to see upgrades made purchasable or found while exploring, rather than getting them from leveling up, to encourage you to use weapons when the time is right, rather than sticking to weapons that need experience. And a couple of the levels have fun concepts too. The Dreamtime's a neat idea, exploring Clank as a shrunken Ratchet might have been cool, the day and night moon swapping between day and night at certain points could have made for some fun puzzles and platforming, but that's just it. They're fun concepts, whereas when they're put into practice, everything falls apart, and it's only partially due to the fact that Size Matters is on the PSP. Daxter gets away with only having one analog stick because it's relatively simple, but Size Matters really could have used a second stick, as rotating the camera with the shoulder buttons and having strafing set to the D-pad is cumbersome, uncomfortable, and just kinda stupid. Thankfully, Size Matters was ported to the PS2, but this didn't really resolve any of the game's other glaring issues, the first being enemies that are huge damage sponges. Look at these tiny little fellas and tell me that I need to expend half of a single weapon's ammo on them. Half! Once you cross the halfway point, smaller enemies entirely disappear, replaced by stronger enemies zipped up into the skin of smaller enemies. You're also usually stuck in very small rooms with enemies in general, where the camera always seems to want to screw with you, and between these two issues they make combat feel very frustrating. And that's not even considering the core of every Ratchet & Clank game, the weapons. If a weapon isn't a weak piece of shit, it sure feels like a weak piece of shit. The concussion gun might be the worst shotgun type weapon in all of gaming. I've used a better shotgun and frickin' hunt down the free flaming, man. Never mind the Rhino being almost 10 million bolts and also being the worst Rhino in the series, bar none. And the less I say about the story, the better. Not only is it painfully unfunny, but it's just stupid. The way it infantilizes Quark feels almost insulting, and the way it walks back on character development made in the original quadrilogy for the sake of a funny makes me want to rip my hair out. Also, whatever was happening with the Clank levels, because when I think of Robot War 3, I think of, Lemmings? Ball game? Once the novelty of a portable Ratchet & Clank game wears off, Size Matters becomes a tedious, mind-numbing experience with awful weapons, enemies that refuse to die in a single lifetime, and story and level design that's almost there but totally fumbles the ball at every opportunity. This feels like an approximation of Ratchet & Clank rather than a true game in the series, like it was AI generated. Because I can't see how anybody at High Impact Games sat down, looked at this and said, yeah, people will like this. And yet people do. That's what confuses me the most. Like, sure, tastes are subjective, and if you enjoy it, more power to ya, but why? I wish I could take a peek into your psyche to see why this game makes you go, oh hell yeah, it's Size Matters. That game's totally chalky milk. Because I will never understand why people like this awful, awful video game for as long as I live. Unsurprisingly, my previous least favourite is now my second least favourite. Quest for Booty is not this low on the list because of things like bad design or glitches and bugs or shoddy weapons or anything like that. If anything, it plays fine. That's because it's a standalone 2 to 3 hour adventure that takes place after Tools of Destruction, hence why it looks an awful lot like Tools of Destruction. Because it basically is. Quest for Booty, in my opinion, never needed to exist. On the story side of things, it's supposed to fill a gap between Tools and its sequel, A Crack in Time, where Ratchet finds out where the Zoni have taken Clank. Something something he's in another system, something something Dr. Nefarious is involved. Look, why was this not a short level at the start of A Crack in Time? It takes 2 hours to basically say Clank is in the Briga system. Not even an exact location either. Hell, you wouldn't have even needed a level to explain this, let alone a whole ass game. And on the gameplay side of things, it adds basically nothing. I guess you get to use the wrench tether mechanic that they eventually use in A Crack in Time, but this is barely a mechanic and more of a press the button to activate the thing. Yeah, not really enough to say that Quest for Booty is worth playing. You also fight almost exactly the same enemies as you did in Tools of Destruction, albeit this time with an annoying green filter slapped over the screen for every fight, with a small selection of the weapons you get in Tools as well. Basically, you're playing a tiny version of Tools with no interesting narrative to back things up, so what's the point? I'm usually a subscriber to the more of a good thing is a good thing ideology, but you at least have to add something new to grab my attention, and Quest for Booty has nothing. It's a nothing game. The only thing I can say I like about Quest for Booty is the opening third, which focuses entirely on platforming. It's a nice change of pace after the previous few games have leaned more and more into having a combat focus while benching platforming and exploration more often. Otherwise, the only reason why this isn't my least favourite in the series is because it's based on Tools of Destruction, which means it plays well. Size Matters is a more original game, but it's also a pale imitation of what makes Ratchet & Clank so good. Either way, Quest for Booty is what I would consider the most skippable game in the series, considering you've experienced almost everything this game has to offer before. And the synopsis, this big missing puzzle piece in the series canon, can be summed up as Clank is in a different system, and Captain Slag sings I'm a Little Teapot. You're welcome. When I gave All for One the Sin treatment all the way back in 2017, I criticised it to the high heavens and back. You'd enjoy it more if you played it with friends, which you clearly don't have, Fivehead. Hey, I have friends. They just don't want to play fucking All for One. After the release of A Crack in Time, the following few years were a very odd time for the series. Not only did we not get a full-fledged game in the series for 12 years, but every release in between was either a shorter, budget-priced entry, or it was trying to reinvent the series and follow trends that it absolutely had no business following. All for One is arguably the worst of these games because while others would at least try to build upon the core third-person shooter gameplay, this was a knockoff of all things, a Lego game. Or at least that's how I see it. Maybe it's a little closer to the co-op brawlers based on licensed properties of the time, which... why? But you've got a fixed camera perspective, puzzles you have to work together to solve, extremely simple combat, all the hallmarks of a Traveller's Tales Lego game, with none of the charm. Good God, this game is boring. Like, sure, go back and play LEGO Star Wars nowadays and you'll find a game that's almost insultingly easy, but the presentation still kinda reels you in, and that's true for most of the LEGO games. In All for One, the puzzles boil down to shooting your partner across a gap, then grappling onto them to cross yourself, or using one of the gadgets you acquire when the game asks you to. Almost never does this game ask you to think whenever any obstacle pops up. If you see a globlobber icon, you use the globlobber. See a laser? Refract it in the right direction. Do you have a rectangle? Put it in the rectangle hole. Combat's been heavily simplified as well, as you only really have to lock onto an enemy and point and shoot until they die, maybe run around in circles like a headless chicken until the enemy goes splat. And if you're using anything other than the Critter Strike or the Plasma Bomb launcher, you're making the game drag out longer than it should. The story's also not great, but at least there's some humour to be found in Ratchet, Clank, Quark and Nefarious being forced to work together. Hell, being able to play as Nefarious is a big point in its favour. Though if I have to hear this one more fucking time...
Few billion volts more, and I'll have a new space station!
The worst thing is that it's a co-op game that barely makes use of the fact that it's a co-op game. Even discarding the previously mentioned puzzles, there are very few segments that require you to all work together. It needed more stuff like the taxi at the start of the game, or piloting that space pod through the asteroid field, not simple combat encounters and on-rails turret sections. And if that came at the cost of making the single-player experience worse, so be it. Lean into the concept more, man. The fact that I found All for One for $10 in a Dick Smith bargain bin less than a year after launch says it all, really. In 2012, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of Ratchet & Clank, a landmark title in the PlayStation 2's catalogue and one of Sony's most consistent and ever-present series. With a 3-hour-long tower defense game. This isn't even a bad idea necessarily. Sure, it's not how I'd celebrate a 10th anniversary of anything. It'd be like if, instead of Halo getting a full-blown remaster for its 10th anniversary, it got a frickin', I don't know, an endless runner. But the concept isn't inherently bad, and at least Full Frontal Assault, known as Q-Force here in Australia, which may or may not confuse the gays, uses the tried but true third-person shooter gameplay that made the other games so good. So at least it had a solid base to build from, right? I mean, for the first few levels, I'd say kinda. It's a decent enough blend of ideas, securing weapons by exploring a level in a sort of traditional sense, and fulfilling objectives while rushing back to intercept incoming waves of enemies and defending your base whenever the McDonald's order alert siren plays.
He tripped and fell in the back of McDonald's.
The Full Frontal Assault ain't at number 11 because it's good, hell no. Weapons are piss weak, for example. Sure, I expect stuff like the Combustor to do bugger all damage, but the Warmonger, the big fuck-off rocket launcher, has no business doing as much damage as a Twitter user with 3 followers asking me how many dogs I've had my way with today. Also, getting rid of the timing mechanic that made the Sonic Eruptor unique was a big misstep. Like, cool, now it's just a shotgun shaped like a frog. Which is neat, I guess, but come on. Game's short as heck, 5 levels, one of which is the second level repeated, but now it's a bit nippy and it's time to rug up. There's only one boss, the enemy variety is puny, and my biggest issue of all, bullet sponges. The 4th level throws out any positive opinions I might have had about the game, because shit like the Grungarian tanks taking so long to kill rubs me the wrong way entirely. Again, weapons are so weak that the Warmonger, the weapon that's supposed to have the highest damage output in the entire game, takes off only a smidgen of the tank's health bar. It also has a horrendous PlayStation Vita port that came out way after the PS3 version, and while it has a decent multiplayer mode apparently, it's laden with copious amounts of cosmetic DLC. Yeah, it's cosmetic, but a lot of it could have just been thrown in the base game, I reckon. Unless you were desperate for the privilege to play as everyone's favourite Ratchet & Clank character, what but? I don't mind this concept, I really don't. The idea of a bite-sized Ratchet experience you can play for a short sitting sounds really good, which is also why I wouldn't be opposed to a Ratchet & Clank Battle Royale or a roguelike. A tower defense Ratchet game could have really worked. Heck, I don't even mind that the villain was Stuart Zergo, the nerdy Quark fan from Going Commando. I thought that was kinda neat. But like the rest of the game, the potential behind this idea was squandered. And that's how I feel about Full Frontal Assault. It's so close to actually being cool. So damn close. But then they do dumb stuff like make weapons weak, lock crummy skins behind DLC, and start blasting the Trollolo song during the story because, look guys, we're up to date with meme culture. Clap, laugh, wonder why the heck you actually paid money for this. Okay, at this point we've gotten all the stuff I don't like out of the way. From here on out, I'd consider everything to be decent at worst, and I'd say that sums up Secret Agent Clank to a T. Like, not to call out other content creators here, but if you think Secret Agent Clank is the worst game you've ever played, then I'm gonna assume you've only played 5 games, and none of them was Size Matters, which is a significantly worse game to me. Like, yeah, SAC, as I will be referring to it from now on because it's funny, sure, SAC feels pretty similar to Size Matters on a fundamental level, and it still suffers from the same control issues that Size Matters had, being a PSP game and all. The writing can occasionally be a bit dodgy, the weapons don't feel as good to use compared to the console games, and splitting the game up between so many different gameplay types and jumping between Clank, Ratchet, and Quark all the time has a pretty adverse effect on the pacing. To be honest though, I don't mind most of the Clank sections at all. His weapons are fun, the enemies aren't too spongy, it feels alright. Same with the Ratchet sections in the prison. But then you're doing some awful out-of-sync rhythm game, or snowboarding down a mountain, or doing forced stealth segments, or playing as a trio of Gadgetbots, or partaking in an opera, which is fine the first time, but boy does it drag on the second time, let alone the third. But ultimately, what I like about SAC is that it feels like they had fun with it. It's a vast improvement over Size Matters in the writing department, as it's a non-canon spin-off taking place in the world of the Holovids Clank stars in, which means they could have a lot of fun with the settings and characters Clank gets tangled up with. And the whole spy theme lends itself well not only to the setting, but Clank's arsenal itself, from explosive tires to a flamethrower briefcase. And some of Ratchet's weapons, despite not feeling as good to use compared to the console games, yeah, are either really fun in concept or have features that would fit right in on console. Put simply, I think SAC is vehemently overhated, and I'd go as far as saying that it's worth a play. Though when I say a play, I mean a play, because not only is challenge mode total bullshit, but most of the aforementioned gameplay types become a chore in repeated playthroughs. The devs also made an incredibly strange decision, almost to a point where it ruins the entire game. Each character has unlockable costumes, but you can't get Quark in a tutu. Whatever man, save your money. Buy the golden compass instead. I might be ruffling a few feathers here, but I also can't see how Tools of Destruction can be ranked any higher considering how great every other game in the series is comparatively. Now, don't take my words out of context, or else. I think Tools of Destruction is good. I like it. I recommend it. But I also think it's the worst mainline Ratchet game, unless we're also counting Quest for Booty and the experimental ones, and I have trouble coming back to it. A big part of that stems from what I think is one of the weakest lineups of weapons in the series. Not necessarily conceptually, but literally. Like, man, these weapons are like pea shooters. Power creep is a thing here as it's always been, so the combustor and plasma beasts and all that will be useless by the halfway point, but even the more powerful weapons feel lacking. The Alpha Disruptor should be, by all accounts, one of the coolest weapons in the game. It's a big fuck-off laser beam you have to charge up. It should be powerful, but by endgame, it's struggling to take out some enemies without expending its entire ammo pool. Stuff like the Negotiator, the Buzzblades, the Predator Launcher, they're all cool, but they feel like they do nothing at times. Halo has spongy enemies, but there are means to taking them out much quicker if you're skilled enough or have the right weapon. In Tools of Destruction, you just gotta keep laying into enemies until they fall down, and yeah, sure, there should be strong enemies with health bars 50 miles long every now and then, but all of them? Yeah, nah, no thanks. Despite this, and some areas that feel pretty cheaply designed, looking at you, Apogee Station, Tools of Destruction still ain't bad. The visuals haven't aged as gracefully as some other games in the series, but as the first next-gen Ratchet game, it was pretty dang solid. There's great level variety, the music's great, the story's interesting if somewhat bloated by the pirate subplot, and it is cool seeing the series finally delve into Ratchet's lineage. Weapons like the Buzzblades would become series mainstays, and rightfully so, and it ended on a solid cliffhanger that didn't leave the main story unresolved and simply opened a new narrative thread instead. It is an early PS3 game, so you do get some motion control gimmicks shoehorned in, like the glider sections and the tornado launcher, and the devices like the Groovatron are a neat idea, but don't gel well with Ratchet and Clank's weapon XP system, because why would you summon Mr. Zircon to kill enemies if he doesn't level up afterward? Also, no retroactive trophy support, 0 out of 10. Overall, Tools of Destruction is pretty decent though, but the weapons and spongy enemies are ultimately what bring the whole experience down for me and place the game firmly into worth a playthrough, but I have no desire to ever touch it again territory. Thankfully, Insomniac were able to refine Tools of Destruction's core gameplay greatly in time for the sequel. The period between A Crack in Time and Rift Apart was a bit of a weird one. Insomniac would try new gameplay styles, infuse the standard third-person shooter gameplay with other genres, and sort of reboot, sort of remake the original game in the series, but if there was one constant in this experimental period, it's that these games were short. Most of them were budget priced, of course, so that's no surprise, but in a way it's kind of cool to have a bite-sized Ratchet & Clank adventure that you can knock out in a few hours. At the same time though, why did Into the Nexus have to be so short, man? If Into the Nexus had been the length of a regular Ratchet game, there might have been a really good chance that it would have broken into my top 3 games in the series, no cap. Because there are so many things to love about it. It goes for a darker, spookier vibe for one, the orphanage might be one of my favourite levels in any Ratchet game, and the story of evil twins accidentally unleashing an invasion of creatures from another dimension is pretty neat, especially when A, they're fun to fight, B, they do be kinda cute, and C, they bring with them one of my favourite weapons in the series. Do not let me sit here and gush about how cool the nether beasts are, or we'll be here all week. The weapons in general are a big part of why I like Into the Nexus so much actually. They're super well balanced and bring a few unique twists to familiar weapon archetypes. The shotgun slows enemies down when you hit them, the sniper slows time while aiming down the scope, and so on. Even the standard Omni Blaster and Fusion Grenade are usable in endgame, which up until this point was only really a thing in Deadlocked with the dual Vipers. Not to mention the nether beasts, like, they're not even that great of a gun, but I don't know man, I've formed an unreasonable attachment to my little otherworldly scrunklies. It's the short length of the game that brings the whole experience down though, and not just because it's over too soon, but because Insomniac tried to fit in a little bit too much into such a short runtime. This marks the introduction of the jetpack, and it was a really cool idea, but it only ever gets properly used in one of the 4 main levels. And yeah, 4 levels. Well, 6 technically, but one's an arena and the other is a small open area where the only thing you have to do to progress is collect some Gargathon horns and hover boot up a ramp, so, you know, whatever. The short length also messes with the pacing a bit, particularly in the final level where you spend the first third exploring a museum, which I think feels a bit too relaxed for the final level. If anything, Meridian City feels like it's supposed to be the level leading into the game's second act, but this is where the game and the Dimensionator saga, at least before Rift Apart, comes to a very abrupt end. The short length doesn't give the writers enough time to develop the characters of Vendra and Neft and Prog, nor does it give Ratchet, Clank and Talwyn enough time to process the loss of Kronk and Zephyr. It also makes repeat playthroughs a bit of a pain, as the first level is a heavily scripted set piece with not a lot of combat and a hell of a lot of leaping between grav surfaces. It's frustrating though, because gosh dang it, it's so close to being great! But its budget pricing and short length do not work in its favour. Not like I'm opposed to short games, not at all. But this game really needed that little bit extra to make it truly stand out as one of the greats in a franchise filled with them. I think Sonic the Hedgehog fans might relate to the 2016 reimagining of Ratchet & Clank. It's a very divisive game, where few people exist outside of one or two camps. Those who think it's the bee's knees, and those who think its mere existence breaches the Geneva Conventions. I lean more towards the former. I think Ratchet 2016 is a lot of fun. I'd even go as far as saying that it plays the best out of any Ratchet game up to that point. Ratchet's movement is snappy and responsive, and the shooting controls have been refined down to the letter, bolstered by some of the better weapons in the series overall. Like Into the Nexus though, it's one of those games that's so close to being great, but it just falls short. Unlike Into the Nexus, it's not a length issue, not as much anyway. It's still short, but it's closer to a full-length game than that was. But it's a bunch of smaller stuff that holds it back, the biggest issue being that awful writing. Even disregarding some of the less satisfying changes to the story, Ratchet himself has had his personality stripped down to the smoothest planks of wood, and there's a near total lack of any wit, charm or humour, or at least any good wit, charm or humour.
Do me a favor, when you use it, post your thoughts on the social medias. The kids love their social medias. Hashtag Gadgetron.
This is the kind of line that should start riots. As a sort of retelling of the original game, many levels are still present, with small tweaks here and there, and they've never looked better. This game's undeniably gorgeous, and I'd be unfazed if Rift Apart came out looking like this for the most part. As the story's changed though, other levels have been cut, including some of the best ones like both Altanus and Altanus Orbit. The weapon selection's fun, and it also has great balancing, which is a trend that has been consistent in recent entries, but all but a few are carryovers from the Future series, with almost no attempt to bring back some of the original game's iconic weaponry. We get versions of the Pyrocitar and Glove of Doom, but otherwise, no Blaster, no Visibomb, no Tesla Claw. You could argue stuff like the Fusion Grenade and Combustor take the place of the Bomb Glove and Blaster, I suppose, but it's disappointing, if not at all surprising considering a lot of the original's weaponry was more situational. Also, bringing back the bouncer but locking it behind a pre-order bonus is scummy as fuck and leaves many players with a permanently empty slot in their quick select, and I feel like it's important to highlight that a series that started by making fun of capitalism and consumer culture was brought down by the very thing it was satirizing. And it's stuff like that that makes me think, yeah, I get why people fell out of love with the series. The polishing of the writing until it's as smooth and inoffensive as possible, the cut levels, the fact that characters never shut up, the lack of new ideas, the further lack of new weapons, the awful Clank levels. I'm just gonna come out and say it, those last two Clank levels were fucking horrible and make challenge mode more tedious than it should be. I think Ratchet 2016 is disliked for totally valid reasons. But it's fun. Man, when it comes right down to it, Ratchet 2016 is just a straight up fun as fuck way to spend 7 or 8 hours. It controls pretty closely to Into the Nexus, and I love how that plays, so this just feels like a more refined version. Even bringing the jetpack back for some fun airborne combat and exploration. It's just good. It lacks heart, but gosh dang it, it's just fun to play. And for all the shit the movie it's based on gets, at least it doesn't have a dance party ending. Can you say that about Megamind? Kung Fu Panda 3? Fantastic Mr. Fox? Fucking Slumdog Millionaire? Exactly. The Ratchet & Clank movie is better than Slumdog Millionaire, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't. My lawyer has advised me to say that for legal purposes, this is a joke. From here on out, I would classify the remaining games in the list as unquestionable bangers. Each one has so many things going for it that they're all legitimately cool in their own right, to the point where deciding in which order I'd rank them was pretty gosh dang tough. It took a lot of careful deliberation, but after sending my underpaid scientists off to conduct weeks of research on my behalf and formulate an opinion for me, number 6 on the list has to go to Ratchet & Clank 3, Up Your Arsenal. This was, and probably still is, many people's favourite in this series, and for a very long time, it was mine too. And there are a lot of reasons to love it. The story, for example. Sure, it stepped away from the satirization of consumerism and went solely for villain bad, let's kick his ass, but Dr. Nefarious was one of the funniest villains around at the time, and even coming back and playing Up Your Arsenal today, he still is. He's super entertaining. Some of the weapons available here might not be the most powerful or versatile, but they are iconic in their own way. Usually when people think of Up Your Arsenal, the plasma whip immediately pops into their head because, yeah, that's a fucking sick idea for a weapon, dude. The spitting hydra that locks onto multiple enemies and taking them all out. The shock cannon and its big beam attack, which you can barely see in the PS3 remaster, fucking raw. Improved versions of the lava gun and mini turret glove. There's some cool stuff here. Not to mention some of the best music in the series. Stuff like Kavu Island, the battle against that one random ass chopper on Dax, the fight against Nefarious, the slightly creepier version of Death to Squishies that plays when fighting Courtney Gears. Again, it's a change from the original game, going for less sample-heavy stuff and more of a full-on orchestra, but I can't imagine this game without its soundtrack. Where it gets a little divisive is how it changes up gameplay. Though it's almost identical to going commando control-wise, a lot of the platforming and exploration has been removed, choosing to focus mostly on combat, which has an adverse effect on level design. All but 2 planets you visit are linear paths with no branching sections, and some planets use a mission-based structure that has you doing stuff in repurposed multiplayer maps. I remember getting so hyped to return to Blackwater City, only to find out that it was 2 bases connected by a bridge. I haven't been this let down since Scott the Was mispronounced Forza.
Forza was missing something.
Do better, Scott. Like, don't get me wrong, Up Your Arsenal's combat is fun, but sometimes it can feel a bit like you're going through the motions, as there's not a lot of ways the game mixes things up between encounters, and it has way less enemy variety compared to the first 2 games. A few of the weapons are also some of the worst this series has to offer. For being on the cover of the game, you'd expect the Infector to do a bit more than at enemies. There's also the Hollow Shield glove that feels like it clashes with Ratchet & Clank's run and gun gameplay, let alone the fact that a shield this wide would barely be able to protect a bloody fly. Never mind the abundance of boring Clank sections, the tedious as heck hacker minigame, the way it underutilizes gadgets like the tractor beam and warp pad, and visuals that I think are actually a bit of a downgrade in some places. Compare Metropolis from Up Your Arsenal to its first appearance back in the original game, and it feels like so much character and detail has been axed entirely. I think a lot of these issues are understandable considering that Insomniac also managed to cram a local and online multiplayer mode into the game as well, which, let's be fair, even if it's a bit clunky now, it kinda kicked ass back in the day. But the focus on multiplayer definitely affected the single player side of the game, and it's a shame because Up Your Arsenal is so close to being brilliant. As it is though, it's one of those games where I can look past its warts and enjoy blasting through it on a lazy weekend or when I'm feeling like a sad sack, because despite not even being in my top 5, it's a pretty comfy game game to come back to. And considering how well documented its rush development was, it's honestly kind of incredible that Up Your Arsenal turned out as good as it did. Now, as we all know, the PS3 has no games. Bon Jovi once famously made a hit 80s rock classic about this subject to raise awareness and get Sony to pull their finger out, and eventually, they did. In 2009, the PS3 finally received its first and only game, Ratchet & Clank: A Crack in Time. I'm choosing to temporarily disregard both The Last of Us and Mod Nation Races, two of my favourite games of all time, for this dumb joke, but whatever. A Crack in Time is easily the best and most fully realised Ratchet & Clank game on Sony's third console. The game's, freaking gorgeous, for one. It turned 13 years old last November, and the only thing here showing its age is the resolution it's capped at, and the fact that it does struggle to maintain 60 FPS a lot of the time. Hence why every game in the series after this was capped to 30, and let's be honest, Full Frontal Assault and Into the Nexus struggle to hit even that. But the environments are lush, the character models are the best they've ever looked up to that point, and the general visual style is incredible. A lot of review outlets were referring to A Crack in Time as the first playable Pixar movie, which is a great disservice to Toy Story on the SNES, but it's not hard to see why they thought that. The combat also saw a bunch of refinements that overall made it much more pleasant to play compared to Tools of Destruction. Enemies were nowhere near as tanky, while the weapon balancing felt so much better too. Stuff like the Constructo pistol and Sonic Eruptor still found use in late game, even if late game weapons ended up more powerful anyway. The Constructo weapons were also an extremely neat idea that it's surprising Insomniac didn't try to bring back similar levels of weapon customization in later games. The story's also another reason why reviewers called this playable Pixar. It certainly has that sort of animated movie style to its writing, in a way. Ratchet meeting another Lombax for the first time is a big deal, and the introduction of Alistar not only gives us more insight into the Lombax race, but results in the most emotionally resonant finale in the entire series, as well as a super cool boss battle. Ratchet & Clank being split up for about 80% of the game sounds like a disaster, because you might think, oh, Clank's gonna get a lot of time on screen himself, which means more Clank levels, which means more But the Clank levels here are not only the best Clank levels, but some of the best sections in the entire series. These puzzles are so imaginative that it makes me, the resident puzzle hater, actually like playing as Clank. Fucking imagine how good they have to be able to do that. A Crack in Time makes some attempt to reintroduce a bit of platforming and exploration, and I think that's where it falters a little. Being able to explore moons and take on side quests between story planets sounds like a cool idea, but I always thought these moons were kind of boring. Most of the platforming challenges feel incredibly basic, and it doesn't help that almost all of them use the same aesthetic where you're jumping across square platforms, while the side quests are simple defeat waves of enemies or tow a guy to a place missions that are barely worth the bolts they give. These parts of the game definitely feel like padding, considering there aren't as many actual planets to explore, and the repetitive ship combat does not help wade that feeling, which is funny because this is my favourite ship combat in the series. I don't really like ship levels, can you tell? I'd also say maybe the enemy design is a little lacking, a bit repetitive. I don't know, I'm struggling to pick out things that I don't especially like, and I think that if the biggest criticism I have is some parts feel like padding, then that says it all. Great weapons, emotional narrative, some of the best bosses in the series, and visuals that haven't aged a bit. A Crack in Time is easily the best of the future saga, and further proof that Insomniac really need to get these games happening on PS5 because oh my god, imagine how good this would look in 4K. Forget about those crummy Marvel games you probably haven't even prototyped yet. Put A Crack in Time on PS5, Insomniac, you cowards. Honestly, I'm never doing a video like this again because do you know how hard it is to choose favourites in a series that's had as many bangers as Ratchet & Clank has? The top 6 were the hardest to decide, and it mostly boiled down to which game had the least amount of things I disliked about it. In retrospect, Going Commando, referred to here as Locked and Loaded, has a lot of things that annoy me. This is the first game to introduce the issue of early weapons being outclassed as early as the halfway point, which became a bit of a trend for a while. It's also got a pretty weak story that boils down to Ratchet flying to different planets, exploring them, then getting a communique whenever it's time to fuck off to the next one, with no real driving force behind the adventure other than Angie Pet needs to be destroyed and we shall do so by following shitty leads and leaving a thorough consistency of dead chicken bots and spitting dune crawlers in our wake. And those bosses, man. Thug Leader aside, as much as I'd love another chance to rant about how a 15-minute turret section that prevents you from using the arsenal you've been amassing for the past 10 hours is fucking awful, and no, the exploit doesn't fix things, you weirdos. These bosses are pretty bad. I asked people what they thought their favourite bosses from the series were at one point, thinking, oh, let's do a top 10 Ratchet & Clank bosses video, which fell through because on further reflection this series has pretty mid boss encounters, but a few people actually said Chainblade? You mean the guy you can simply jump to avoid his attacks? It's not very chalky milk, fellas. The thief has less health than a Shedinja, the Protopet is a pretty lame final boss, and I've never figured out how to avoid this attack from the B2 Brawler because it feels like it has a 100% chance of hitting at a certain point, not to mention the legs. It takes a lot to make one of the sexiest things on earth not sexy, and yet Insomniac managed it. That's not very chalky milk. Why did I use chalky milk 3 times in this script? I don't even like chalky milk that much, man. Vanilla malt supremacy. Okay, so it sounds like I hate going commando, but come on, it's not at number 4 for nothing. Disregarding my other issues with the game, namely the ship levels, which are little more than letting an enemy fly in front of you before you make them explode, going commando deserves a lot of respect for not only introducing so many of the series' eventual mainstays, but doing such a good job with them that it's still a game worth going back to this day. The addition of strafing is arguably the biggest addition, which not only makes movement during combat so much easier, but allows for a bigger focus on combat as a result. No more inching left and right to aim or using the shitty thruster pack hover strafe thing, and while it would have been nice to be able to tie the fire button to R1 instead of circle, it still holds up really well. Not to mention, the weapon selection is straight up iconic. The Heavy Bouncer and Plasma Storm will always be some of my favourite weapons in gaming in general, but you've also got some other cool stuff like the Blitz Gun, Seeker Gun, Mini Nuke, maybe the best rendition of the Rhino. There aren't many guns here I dislike using, which considering there's 24 of them, that's an impressive feat. Going Commando would also introduce the Weapon XP system, where a weapon would upgrade after prolonged use, and while I've always had my own, probably unpopular opinions on this, there's no denying that it's a satisfying endeavour trying to get all your weapons upgraded to see what else they'd be capable of. While combat is a bit more of a focus in Going Commando, it hasn't forgotten its platforming roots, with planets almost always having multiple paths to explore and pretty well hidden collectibles used both to upgrade your weapons with mods that deal extra damage, as well as upgrading your health, rewarding exploration like few other games in the series have. These levels are also super pretty, especially for the time. It's a weird one, but whenever I think of Going Commando, I always think of Smog. I don't know, I always like this sort of cloudy, high altitude atmosphere, which is funny because of my crippling fear of heights. And for as much as the story is pretty lame, the writing itself is still on point. Ratchet and Clank themselves have a lot of funny interactions. Fizzwidget, or I guess Quark, is one of my favourite characters in the franchise, and there's no shortage of poking fun at consumerism and capitalism in the same vein as the first game. The first few Ratchet games still have a lot of funny writing, and it's understandable why so many people miss it. Despite the pretty crappy boss battles and the ship levels that frequently interrupt the rest of the game, Going Commando is still absolutely worth playing. It holds up remarkably well gameplay-wise, and if there was a genuine effort to bring this and the rest of the PS2 quadrilogy to modern consoles, I think these games will continue to stand the test of time, even decades from now. For all its improvements though, Going Commando isn't my favourite of the original trilogy, despite honestly probably being the better game overall. We all know where this is going. I want to say this is me being blinded by nostalgia goggles, but nah, the original Ratchet & Clank wasn't even my first experience with the series. I'm not sure if I've ever mentioned this on the channel before, but the first time I saw Ratchet & Clank I was kinda scared of it. It was a preview of the game on an old Aussie music show called Video Hits, and I think it was a combination of the footage being low quality and really dark for some reason, and the fact that I hated playing games with guns at the time. Every time I'd try to play Siphon Filter, for example, I'd just freak out whenever I got shot. It's probably an autism thing, and ironically I'd say shooters are rapidly approaching being one of my favourite genres now, but I never played the first Ratchet & Clank until after our Nan, God rest her soul, got Going Commando for us for Christmas of 2004. Then I played 3, then I played the first. I wish I'd played the original first though, cause it might have made me appreciate it a bit more the first time around. It was a little harder to get into compared to the others, everything felt a lot more stiff. Ratchet took a bit longer to start running, his double jump slowed him right down, and aside from the crummy hover mode you got with the thruster pack, there was no strafing. If you wanted to shoot an enemy, you kinda just had to turn towards them and spray and pray, which felt a lot clunkier. And yet, that first installment weirdness aside, the original Ratchet & Clank holds up better than it probably has any right to. Despite not settling into the series grooves just yet, there's something about the original that still stands out when compared to the rest of the series. There's a bigger focus on platforming, with levels like Umbrus almost entirely devoid of any actual combat, and infamous sections such as the self-destruct sequence at the BTS and the Rising Water section in Blackwater City that have enemies, but are more about quick reflexes and platforming skills. Not to say the game doesn't have combat-focused areas, of course, but while combat is not as polished or fluid as any other game in the series, maybe sans the PSP games, the weapon selection and enemy design fit perfectly perfectly well. You might have some duds like the Taunter, and some of the wackier weapons like the Suck Cannon and Morpho Ray have limited use, but almost every weapon has its own application, not to mention the Omni Wrench actually being useful, unlike almost any other game in the series after this. It's not like newer games where usually you can pick your favourite weapon and go in all guns blazing. You need to put in a little bit of thought as to what you use, as Ratchet's not a very strong boy in this one, and using certain weapons on certain enemies is asking for an ass pounding. OG Ratchet & Clank's also the place to go if you want to experience more of a sense of exploration, as it's heavily dependent on blocking off progression behind acquiring new gadgets, items, and sometimes even weapons themselves, such as on the Gemlik base. Levels themselves are super well designed and have a memorable atmosphere to them, with the aforementioned Gemlik base being one of my favourite levels in the entire series, owing not only to the visual design, but the excellent score backing it up. And so many levels are like this. Even my least favourite levels towards the end of the game are at least fun because they look and sound cool. And really, that might be the major thing holding this game back at the number 3 spot. Those final few levels are a little bit of a drag, especially the ones with the Ginyu Force-ass troopers, where the best strategy is to sit behind cover or duck around a corner and fire a few Visibombs at them. Almost no other weapon is effective against them outside from the Devastator or the Rhino, which you won't even have yet, and it makes this part a bit of a slog on top of the back-to-back Hologuise levels, which would have been fine if they were set a few levels apart, but otherwise slow the final part of the game down to a crawl. I was also never a huge fan of the little hissy fit between these two either, because almost every cutscene between the 7th and 13th level was Ratchet being a huge fucking asshole to Clank for a pretty shitty reason, but the rest of the game though? Aside from the control issues, which aren't even really a hindrance anyway, the original Ratchet & Clank still holds up as one of the best 3D platformers out there. The gimmick of sticking a gun in the hands of a cute furry mascot was, in retrospect, kinda genius, and the game surrounding that idea capitalizes on it almost perfectly, with fun writing, memorable music, and visual design that still looks incredible today, except for maybe some of the character models. Like, it's kinda weird that Ratchet smiles 98% of the time, even when he's pissed. No one else ever noticed this? No? Anyway, whatever, Ratchet & Clank kicks ass. Where my Cheeto gun gang at? I think most of us were pretty worried about the direction Insomniac would take when they announced Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. I was confident it'd be great because I'm one of those gigantic idiots that enjoyed the PS4 reimagining's gameplay, but even I was a bit skeptical seeing as the writing had taken a bit of a nosedive in the duo's sole PS4 entry. Looking back on that time of unease and skepticism, we were fools. Fools of the highest caliber. I played Rift Apart no less than 5 times in the first few weeks of its release because of how much I loved it, and during that time I thought recency bias may cause my opinion of it to dwindle upon revisiting it, but hell no, Rift Apart still kicks ass. A big part of this is the introduction of Rivet and Kit. I really think the series needed something to mix things up a bit, seeing as Ratchet's story was a little played out by this point, so having something as simple as Ratchet and Clank meeting their alternate dimension counterparts was just what the series needed. It also helps that Rivet is a frickin' gender. Ratchet's cool and all, but I think he's had his time in the spotlight. Give the Queen her turn. I'm also a sucker for characters with robotic arms. Yes, look, I am slightly biased. Do you think I care? Gameplay-wise, at least if we're talking about combat, the series is the best it's ever been. The introduction of a dodge move fits in so well with the control scheme here, even if we have to give up the long jump for it, but it's the new arsenal that's the star of the show here. For the first time since God knows when, the majority of the weapon roster is new stuff. Yeah, some weapons fit into old archetypes, but do you know how nice it is not seeing the Warmonger for the 5th fucking time? Oh god damn it. For real though, even the 5 weapons that do return all feel great, but some of the new ones feel so inspired. The Ricochet's always been a highlight to me, but I'm a big fan of the Negatron Collider, Black Hole Storm, Void Repulsor, and the Enforcer. Mostly for taking tried but true weapon formulas from previous games and either giving them a new gimmick or making use of the DualSense in a fun way. Yeah, like Tools of Destruction, Rift Apart is a showcase for Sony's new hardware, but unlike Tools of Destruction, which threw in unnecessary motion controls for useless weapons and throwaway minigames, Rift Apart uses the DualSense's haptic feedback and hair triggers to deliver a more immersive experience. Pushing the trigger down halfway might do something like fire 1 round instead of 2 or begin to charge the weapon up, etc, but they even went as far as making the controller vibrate unique little sounds whenever you equip or fire a weapon. I'm avoiding the obvious joke here, but gosh, that's so freaking cool. I could go on and on about how gorgeous this game looks, how it successfully uses the PS5's hardware to pretty much obliterate loading times, how it seamlessly transitions between multiple levels at certain points, and further gush over how cute Rivet is, but by far my favorite thing about Rift Apart is how Insomniac went out of their way, unintentionally or not, to make this the most replayable game in the series. One thing I always hated about replaying old Ratchet games was having to do certain bits multiple times, hacker puzzles, Clank levels, ship sections. Aside from a couple annoying bits riding Trudy, which over pretty quickly anyway, Rift Apart allows you to skip specific parts of the game that don't change between different playthroughs or aren't affected by difficulty, namely the Clank puzzles and the I've forgotten her name, the spider bot. Yeah. These parts are skippable for the sake of accessibility, but it also means that whenever I want to jump back into Rift Apart, I don't need to worry about replaying Clank bits again because I can just go beep bop boop beep and I'm back in the action. If there are any criticisms to be made, it's that they don't do enough with the idea of dimensional rifts, as they're either a part of scripted sequences, easy platforming segments, or they're found in combat arenas where, honestly, warping to one doesn't really give you that much of an advantage over slapping on your hover boots. The dimensional pockets also felt like they were going to have more challenging platforming sections in them as the game went on, similar to Super Mario Sunshine, but not a single one of them is at all difficult. It feels like they establish a concept, but then instead of building upon it, they just leave it at that. And if we're being nitpicky, the trophy list blows chunks because there's no reward for fully upgrading weapons or beating the game in a higher difficulty, etc, etc. These are tiny blemishes on what's otherwise a brilliant game though. A game that proves that Insomniac still knows how to invigorate life into what many were calling a dying series. It's also, I reckon, the best PS5 exclusive right now. That's not hard because there are literally 5 PS5 exclusives right now, and one of them is also coming to PC this year. Wow, that's sad, but still, if there were 5 exclusives or 500, Rift Apart would still be at least near the top. It's a fantastic game in its own right and a true technological achievement. I would kiss. After way too much deliberation, what my favourite game in the series would come down to would depend on what my favourite part of the series is, and which game does that one thing best. If it were platforming and exploration, it'd be the first game, easy. Humor, Ratchet Clank 3. Replayability, maybe Rift Apart. Uncomfortable, cringe-inducing sound design, size matters. I actually hate this game, but while many people would say exploration is an essential part of the series, hence why they can't get into some of the newer games, I don't think it's absolutely necessary. The most important part of a Ratchet & Clank game to me has always been how it handles combat, and while Rift Apart comes damn close in that regard, it's Deadlock that just barely edges it out. Deadlocked, known as Gladiator here in Upside Down Country, feels like a more arcadey take on the formula, where exploring levels at your own pace has been replaced entirely by doubling down on the combat side of things, choosing to focus on challenges reminiscent of the arenas and death courses from 2 and 3. The action hits hard and fast, with shitloads of enemies around every corner trying to stop you from fulfilling your objective, and you've got just the arsenal for the job. It's a smaller lineup of weapons than usual, with only 10 available, but this means weapon balancing is on point. Every weapon has its use, even the Holo Shield launcher, and you'll really be tested on how well you use them as you move up through each difficulty. And stuff like the Dual Vipers, Magma Cannon, and Scorpion Flail are insanely cool weapons, but also do not get me started on the Harbinger. I will gush about this thing for days, it is so fucking cool! And being able to customize your weapons with mods that change stuff like ammo count, fire rate, blast radius, or changing how they behave entirely by turning rockets into sticky bombs, making rounds drop puddles of napalm. This is easily my favorite weapon roster in the series because of it, and it's insane that they never brought this feature back. There's not a single part of Deadlock that I actively dislike. I'd say my least favourite parts are the Landstalker missions, especially the on-rails target shooting ones, but even those are fine. For every just fine moment, there are heaps of other cool moments. Breaking your combat bots out of prison, fighting on a planet ravaged by a meteor shower, making your way through the ghost station, and of course, those bosses. Ratchet & Clank's bosses are usually pretty meh, like I've said, but Deadlocked is the one exception. I didn't remember Gleam and Vox being such an enjoyable fight, dude, holy shit. Even the story's pretty good. It's inessential in the grand scheme of things, like the world's edgiest filler episode, but filler episodes are good too. Ratchet, Clank and Al all being forced to participate in a televised death sport is a fun idea that combines the first 2 games' jabs at consumerism with the third's pop culture humour to make something that's a little darker in tone, but still goofy when it needs to be, largely pertaining to the decision to have commentators Dallas and Juanita throw quips at each other while you pump rockets into robot zombies. something they somehow totally botched in the PS3 remaster, seeing as you don't even get to hear half of it. This is like if Idle Minds searched remaster on the internet, but they used Dogpile instead of Google. But for real, Deadlocked is so fun that its lesser quality seems so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Like, sure, the enemy variety is pretty weak, and it sucks that Ratchet never really banters with Merc or Green, and the vehicle sections sometimes feel like discount Halo, and the platforming they do sometimes make you do is almost insulting, but I could care less. Deadlocked fully embraces the best part about Ratchet & Clank games, and it's all the better for it. The weapons are sick, it's super replayable, it's funny as hell, and it's got the guy who plays Timmy Turner's dad. What more could you possibly want, you spoilt little shit? Big thanks to Furball, Sofox, Aetheric Ruby, K, Damie Maxted, Nation McGaltal, Soul Gaming 1, Feeny Shay, Heathoot Skyet, Jayet, Johanna Sanderson, Kurochi the Kitsune, Pear Basket, Philip Elk, Rodent Bird, Scadius Grim, Squid Superstar, The Dervinator, Sadie Killer, and Chris Fireball. Follow me on Twitter, join the Discord, support me on Patreon, always helps out a whole bunch, and I will see everyone next time for the top 10 of 2022. Happy Hanukkah!